Shona N. Castleton was born in 1966 in the picturesque city of Salt Lake City, located in the state of Utah, USA. She had an inseparable older sister, Paula, with whom she maintained a close bond throughout her life. In 1994, at the age of 28, Shona fulfilled her long-held dream and moved to Las Vegas, a city that beckoned her with its endless opportunities. Initially, she found a job as a saleswoman in a cosmetic store, but this was merely a stepping stone to something greater. Shona was enticed by the vibrant nightlife of Las Vegas, where big money, success, and wealth reigned supreme. Fortune smiled upon her when she was offered a position as a waitress at one of the most prestigious casinos, Pawns. Shona quickly won over her colleagues and guests with her attractive appearance and friendly demeanor. Her co-workers became like a second family to her. Always smiling, radiant, and full of life, Shona earned the nickname Barbie from her loved ones for her charming smile, blonde hair, and model-like looks. She absolutely adored this job, and the customers simply loved her. Moreover, her salary of $100,000 per year was more than decent. However, the Pawns Casino not only provided Shona with financial stability and good friends but also true love. It was here in 2002 that she met her future husband, George Tiafi. It was love at first sight. George was an incredibly attractive, charismatic, and charming guy. At the time, he worked as a firefighter and selflessly helped people. George deeply valued his family and sent part of his salary home every month to support his mother, who was caring for his younger sister with a disability. George's incredible looks even brought him fame as a model. His photos graced the calendar of the fire department. Together, they made a remarkably harmonious and striking couple, radiating happiness and love. From their very first meeting, Shona and George became inseparable, and soon decided to live together. Just a year later, they welcomed a baby girl, Madison, who became Shona's true purpose in life. While her husband put out fires, she fully devoted herself to raising their daughter and taking care of the household. 3 years later, the couple had a fairy tale wedding in Hawaii, right on the ocean shore, surrounded by their closest loved ones. Shona's life seemed like a magical fairy tale. However, this story, unfortunately, would not have a happy ending. 2 years later, the family went through a difficult period. George suffered serious financial losses after making an ill-fated investment in real estate. To support the family, Shona had to return to work and become the main breadwinner, while her husband, exhausted by his failures, fell into a prolonged depression. George struggled with the lack of a stable income, but at that time, he could do nothing about it. Instead, he began to be jealous of his wife and expressed dissatisfaction with her revealing outfits at work. But Shona couldn't dress differently, as her profession demanded such a dress code. The tension in their relationship gradually grew. The situation escalated further when George befriended a homeless man and started bringing him home. Shona found this man creepy and he terrified her. George had helped the homeless before, but he had never invited them into their house. Now, he had crossed the line. Her husband's antics finally pushed Shona over the edge. Concerned for her own safety and that of her daughter, after almost 10 years of living together, she moved out from George and settled into a separate apartment in a townhouse. Shona was devastated and depressed by the breakdown of her family, which did not go unnoticed by her loved ones. However, being an optimist by nature, she hoped that she and George would be able to save their marriage. Her husband also did not want a divorce. The couple even started seeing a family psychotherapist, trying to preserve their relationship. However, this did not bring the desired results. Too many mutual grievances and recriminations had accumulated between them. Eventually, Shona decided to file for divorce. The former spouses began a legal battle for custody of their daughter. Shona immersed herself in her work, which, along with spending time with Madison, remained her only solace and a way to distract herself from her family troubles. But in early September 2012, something unexpected happened. Upon returning home from work one day, Shona noticed that someone had been in the house. There was chaos everywhere, and some valuable items were missing, including her wedding ring. But the strangest thing was that along with the valuables, her bikini had also disappeared. Instead, the intruder left a pair of small men's boxers in the apartment. The police immediately noted that this was not at all like a typical burglary. Shona was horrified by the invasion of her home but decided not to escalate the situation. The woman had no idea that by a fatal coincidence, exactly 3 weeks later, someone would visit her home again, but this time with much more sinister intentions. On September 29, 2012, Shona left work as usual, around 3 in the morning. At 3:30, she parked her car in the garage, went up to her apartment, and closed the door behind her. After that, no one ever saw her alive again. The next morning, after finishing his 24-hour shift, George went to pick up 8-year-old Madison from her grandmother's house, so that he and his daughter could then go to Shona's place to get the girls' things. The garage and apartment doors were suspiciously open. And when they went inside, they saw complete disarray, with things scattered everywhere. But the most horrific sight awaited them in the room. In the middle of a pool of blood lay Shona's lifeless body. A stunned George called 911 and reported the gruesome discovery. The police immediately rushed to the crime scene and began investigating this brutal murder. An examination of the body showed that Shona had been subjected to an extremely brutal attack. Her skull was almost crushed, so at first, the police and medics assumed that the cause of death was a gunshot to the head. But the coroner uncovered the chilling truth: the woman had been beaten to death with a hammer. Shona's fingers were broken. Apparently, she had desperately tried to defend herself against the attacker, but to no avail. The inhuman assailant methodically struck her until the unfortunate victim stopped showing signs of life. In total, Shona's body had a staggering 17 marks from hammer blows. George was the first on the list of suspects. He had found the body of his ex-wife, and the couple was in the process of divorcing. However, the man had an ironclad alibi. At the time of the crime, he was on a 24-hour shift, which was confirmed by his colleagues and surveillance camera footage. Therefore, George had to be excluded from the circle of suspects. Shona's neighbors told investigators that they had heard strange noises coming from her apartment that night. But no one paid much attention to it, as the woman usually returned home from work late. And another resident of the building found some documents and personal belongings of the deceased, such as her phone and cosmetic bag, near the dumpsters and immediately handed them over to the police. The investigators remembered the recent break-in at Shona's apartment, during which the perpetrator had stolen some valuables and left men's underwear in the dwelling. Even then, this detail seemed suspicious to the cops, so they decided to take a closer look at this angle. Shona was an extremely attractive and striking woman, so she could well have had a secret admirer-stalker obsessed with her. This would explain the theft of her bikini. Or perhaps she accidentally caught the eye of a burglar who had just broken into the house, and when Shona unexpectedly returned home, the thief had to deal with an unwanted witness. This version also aligned with the fact that the victim's personal belongings were found near the crime scene. Perhaps the thief had grabbed them along with the valuables and then lost them while fleeing. But as the investigation unfolded, it turned out that no valuables were missing from Shona's apartment, so the version of a failed robbery had to be discarded. The murdered woman's colleagues were stunned and horrified by this brutal killing. They feared that the maniac who had stalked Shona might come after them as well. The detectives carefully studied the surveillance camera footage from the victim's workplace to check if someone had been constantly following her. But the video materials did not confirm the version of a stalker. Judging by them, no one was watching Shona. Thus, this lead also turned out to be false. Upon learning of the tragedy, the victim's sister Paula and her husband took the first flight to Las Vegas to join the investigation. Unlike the bewildered detectives, she immediately stated that she was certain who had committed this horrible crime. Paula suspected George, Shona's ex-husband. In her opinion, he could have either dealt with his ex-wife himself or hired someone to do it. Meanwhile, the police received information that one of the local homeless men had been bragging somewhere about beating a woman to death with a hammer. At first, no one paid much attention to this, as such drunken babbling is not uncommon among vagrants. But when gruesome rumors about Shona's brutal murder began to spread through the city, the homeless man's words took on an ominous meaning. The cops quickly tracked down the suspicious character near the store where he constantly hung around, trying to swipe food. When they searched him, they found illegal substances, which was enough for an arrest. The detainee identified himself as Noyo Stevens. He had previously been held responsible for minor offenses but categorically denied any involvement in Shona's murder. The detectives visited the abandoned tent in the desert where Noyo lived and thoroughly searched the surrounding area. There they managed to find quite a few interesting things. Next to the tent itself lay bloody jeans, which were immediately sent for examination to the forensic laboratory. The DNA analysis results confirmed the investigators' suspicions. The blood on the pants belonged to Shona, and the piece of evidence was abundantly strewn with Noyo's genetic material. A receipt from a store was also found in the pocket of the jeans. The police immediately requested the surveillance camera footage from the point of sale for the time indicated on the receipt. The video clearly shows Noyo paying cash for a hammer and a pair of men's boxers. Continuing to dig into the suspect's past, the cops turned to checking his phone contacts. It turned out that Noyo had only one regular contact, with whom he had called 87 times. And, lo and behold, this contact turned out to be none other than George Tiafi, the widower of the murdered Shona. This vagrant was the same homeless friend whom George had brought home and who had so frightened Shona that she had even moved out from her husband. Noyo confirmed that George was listed in his contacts as a firefighter friend. The detectives reviewed the store's video footage again to find out how Noyo got there. And they saw that the homeless man did not come to the store alone, but with some man, and the two of them spent a long time selecting goods. This companion, of course, was George, Shona's ex-husband. Now the whole picture came together like a puzzle. George had persuaded his vagrant friend to help him get rid of his wife. He carefully planned the crime, informing his accomplice when exactly Shona would return home. George also chose a day for the terrible massacre when he himself would be on a 24-hour shift, thereby providing himself with an impeccable alibi. The ex-husband was convinced that he had organized the perfect murder that would never be solved. But he had made a fatal miscalculation. When the detectives announced to Noyo what evidence they had against him, he quickly gave in and admitted that it was he who had brutally killed Shona. But he immediately began giving testimony, accusing George of organizing the crime. According to him, George had long wished for his wife's death and had even paid his accomplice an advance of $600. And after successfully completing the order, he promised to reward him with several more tens of thousands, as soon as he received the insurance money for his wife. It immediately became clear to the police what motive drove the mastermind behind the murder: the desire for easy profit. As Noyo recounted, he and George had carefully planned this crime well in advance. 3 weeks before the massacre, they staged a robbery of Shona's home to throw the detectives off the trail, directing the investigation down the wrong path. Noyo felt sincere gratitude towards George, who for many years had been his best and only friend, helping and supporting him in every way possible. Therefore, the vagrant agreed without hesitation to assist his buddy in getting rid of his annoying wife. Noyo described in detail what happened in the house on the day of the murder. He had snuck into the apartment in advance, while Shona was not at home, using the spare key that George had given him. The attacker patiently waited for the victim in ambush. Hearing the lock click in the door, Noyo put on a mask and hid. When the unsuspecting Shona went upstairs, the killer jumped out of hiding and pounced on her from behind, armed with a hammer. From the unexpected blow, the woman fell to the floor, and Noyo, leaping on top of her, began to hammer her on the head with all his might. Shona desperately fought back, crying and pleading, repeating over and over, "Why? Why are you doing this? But when she saw the attacker's face, she immediately understood everything. However, it was too late. The frenzied killer could not leave her alive. The terrible blows rained down with such fury that the hammer could not withstand it and broke. But even this did not stop the enraged Noyo. Grabbing the metal part, the crazed executioner continued to torment the defenseless victim until she stopped moving. Having finished his dirty deed, the killer fled, not even bothering to close the door of the house. Noyo indicated the place where he had hidden the murder weapon, near his tent shelter in the desert. And indeed, the broken hammer was found there. The detectives summoned George's mother and sister for questioning and informed them of his involvement in this horrific crime. The relatives categorically denied that he could be capable of such brutality. Immediately after talking to the police, the frightened sister called George and warned him that the investigators already knew everything and would soon come for him. The man realized that this was the end. In desperation, he grabbed his car keys, drove the vehicle at a breakneck speed of over 100 kilometers per hour, and crashed into a fence. The cops suspect that with this suicidal act, George was trying to settle scores with life, because there were no traces of braking on the road, so the accident was intentional. Amazingly, the man survived the collision, although he suffered serious injuries. George was hospitalized, and as soon as the doctors allowed transportation, the suspect was arrested on charges of murdering his wife. To this, he replied only with a terse, "Okay." George Tiafi and his accomplice Noyo Stevens were officially charged with the brutal murder of Shona Castleton. However, George stubbornly denied any involvement in this crime against his ex-wife. During a search of his house, the police found a gun purchased shortly after Shona's death. Detectives suspect that George planned to get rid of his homeless friend in order not to share the insurance money with him and to remove an unwanted witness before the trial. The evidence against Noyo Stevens was simply staggering, and the man fully admitted his guilt. Therefore, his trial ended very quickly. Noyo made a deal with the investigation and agreed to testify against George during his trial. Thanks to this agreement, the prosecutors dropped the demand for the death penalty for Stevens. However, this did not save him from the most severe punishment, life imprisonment with the right to parole no earlier than 42 years later. But as for George, there was little evidence against him, mostly circumstantial evidence and Noyo's testimony. The prosecutors understood that Tiafi had manipulated his simple-minded homeless friend, who did not have enough intelligence to organize such an intricate plot on his own. But proving this in court was extremely difficult, and George had every chance of getting off scot-free. George's defense attorney skillfully portrayed to the jury the image of his client as a heroic firefighter, an exemplary family man, devoted to his beloved wife and daughter. The lawyer insisted that Noyo had killed Shona out of revenge, as the woman disliked the vagrant and was divorcing his best friend. And George, allegedly, had nothing to do with it at all. The defense also claimed that Stevens suffered from a mental disorder and hallucinations, and therefore his words should not be trusted. So convincing the jury of Tiafi's guilt seemed like an almost impossible task. However, the store's surveillance camera footage, showing Noyo and George together choosing a hammer, as well as printouts of their phone conversations, became extremely compelling evidence of a conspiracy. Although Tiafi's lawyer tried to downplay their significance, saying that the men were just friends, often communicated, and bought the hammer for household needs. Throughout the entire trial, George maintained a remarkably impassive demeanor, even when his closest friend Noyo testified against him. Tiafi's relatives, friends, and colleagues unanimously assured that he was an extremely kind and even-tempered man who would never harm anyone. They claimed that George loved Shona and their daughter immensely and could never have ordered the murder of his adored wife. However, the jury did not believe these moving speeches. Only 3 long years after Shona's terrible murder did justice finally prevail. George Tiafi was found guilty of conspiracy and first-degree murder. His loved ones pleaded for leniency in sentencing, but to no avail. The court handed down the harshest possible punishment to George, life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. During the announcement of the verdict, the convict showed no emotion. His family refused to believe in George's guilt and disagreed with the court's decision. On the other hand, Shona's relatives were completely satisfied with this outcome. They were convinced that the best punishment for her killer would be to rot behind bars until the end of his days. However, George later filed an appeal, claiming that his lawyer had been ineffective and had ignored the documented mental health issues of his client. Allegedly, Tiafi had been taking potent medications that clouded his mind. In this state, he heard the voice of God himself, who supposedly ordered him to kill his wife for the sake of saving his daughter. But the defense attorney did not even send George for a psychiatric evaluation. However, the lawyer refuted all these accusations, stating that he was hearing about Tiafi's mental health problems for the first time. Thus, the appeal was rejected. Shona's 1-year-old daughter lost both parents at once. Now the girl lives with her grandmother, and her Aunt Paula often visits her. Madison never forgets to remember her beloved mother and misses her terribly. Thank you for watching this story. Write your thoughts about it in the comments. Don't miss the future videos, subscribe and like the channel. Take care of yourself and people you love.